because they said you don't have to report those on your books. You can keep all those derivatives off your books if you do your accounting a certain way, which they all did. Okay? Now, so here's what happened there. Bonds are complicated, and a bunch of mortgages together. Let's think about a single house in Copperas, Cove, or Killeen. Doesn't matter. And let's say somebody gets a mortgage on this house for $100,000. And it's one of these junk mortgages, and it's going to go bad in a few years, and they're going to have to foreclose, and they're going to sell it, and they're only going to get $50,000 for it. Okay, I'm making these numbers up, but they're close enough. So somebody's going to lose $50,000. Whoever owns the bond that mortgage is in would lose $50,000 normally. Except they wouldn't really lose it because they could go to AIG and they had to make it good. Because they're the default risk. It was AIG, so AIG would make it good. But AIG's going to lose $50,000. Somebody's going to lose $50,000. And that's bad, but it's $50,000. Okay. But what if 100 people had a side bet on where this one person in Killeen could pay this mortgage? Then you've got not a $50,000 loss, but 50,000 times 100, assuming the securities were the same size. And they weren't all. I'm just trying to keep the math simple. But anyway, I think I'm scaring folks. There's too much honesty going on here. but anyway, so what would happen is the loss on this one house in Killeen would not be 50,000, but 50,000 times 100 or $5 million. There was $5 million bet on whether or not this one person in Killeen paid their mortgage. That's how a multi-hundred billion dollar problem, and it's off the books, nobody knows about it. Multi-hundred billion dollar problem becomes a multi-trillion dollar problem and a huge crisis. And that's where we ended up. Now, I have 5 kids. My youngest son, who's the 4th youngest of my 5 kids, was supposed to graduate from the University of Texas in December with a major in 6th Street. But as it turns out, he didn't. Now, we had hotel rooms booked for graduation, and we were planning for a lot of the family to come for graduation, and we were going to have some nice little party after graduation for my son. But he wasn't going to graduate. And he had known for quite some time he wasn't going to graduate. And he finally got to the point that, when you're kind of packing the car, he had to come and talk to Mama. And when you come to Mama with a situation like that, the first thing you have to do is confess. Okay? That's kind of the situation all these big financial institutions started finding themselves in. They looked around, and they had guaranteed all these mortgages. All these losses were happening. They sold all these side bets. All these side bets were happening. And all of a sudden, they owed a whole bunch of money. Well, these are supposed to be a zero-sum game. If somebody loses $50,000, somebody makes $50,000. But that's only true if the losers can pay the winners. If the losers can't pay the winners, everybody's a loser. And that's kind of the situation we got ourselves into. And they all had to start coming to the government. And when they came to the government, like my son Blake, they had to fess up. Okay? And, people had guessed maybe they would have $50 billion in these side bets. We knew they were out there. We shouldn't have anyway known what they were. And they'd say, no, it wasn't exactly $50 billion. It was more like $400 billion. That was AIG. Or $300 billion from Lehman Brothers. Or $300 billion from Merrill Lynch. Across the board. And all of a sudden, the government's here with this avalanche that's like trillions of dollars that nobody knew about. And the financial system is starting to implode. Because when this happens, credit starts drying up. Now, why in the world did credit start drying up? What does this have to do with everyday credit for a business or something like that? Well, the way the banking system works, banks are required to keep a certain amount of reserves, which, by the way, they didn't make these investment banks do that. That was another thing that the SEC did in their wisdom. They did away with all that. So instead of keeping a 10-to-1 ratio like most banks, they were keeping about 70-to-1 on lending versus what they had in their pockets. But anyway, aside from that, the way the system works is every day some banks have too many reserves and some banks have not enough reserves. And they tend to lend them to each other. And there's a very big organized world market where banks lend to each other at a rate called LIBOR that many of you have heard of, the London Interbank Offering Rate. That's the interest rates that banks lend money to one another for a day or a week or sometimes a month. And LIBOR is usually a very low interest rate because it's one bank lending money to another bank backed by a government security usually. So that's pretty safe. And Treasury bills always have the lowest interest rate because they're viewed as the safest investment out there because it's backed by the U.S. government. And so normally you have Treasury rates here, LIBOR here, and they kind of move together all the time. They're pretty close together. Well, what happened all of a sudden was, I'm oversimplifying a little bit here, but not too much. This is really the gist of what happened. Most of the banks every day that have extra reserves are your very good local community banks, regional banks, super regional banks. We have a bunch of them right here in Central Texas that are very well run. They manage themselves pretty conservatively, and they usually have extra reserves. And the ones that are skirting along the edge usually have to borrow money are the bigger banks. So basically what this whole international market is that goes on all the time, every night, hundreds of billions of dollars changing hands every night, is smaller banks lending to larger banks. Well, all of a sudden they look around and see all this mess, and the smaller banks say, we don't want to lend money to you guys. You lied. You know, you've been telling us you were safe and had all this stuff, and all the time you had all this mess on the side. We don't want to mess with you anymore. And so what happened was, in order to get them to lend money, LIBOR started going up. At the same time, everybody's nervous about all this thing happening. When people are nervous, they want safety. So everybody started buying Treasury bills, and Treasury bills went down. In fact, they got down to zero for a little while. I mean, people were literally, if you counted the transaction costs, people were paying the government to hold their money. I don't quite understand why they didn't just hold it in cash, but they somehow wanted a piece of paper, so they literally paid the government to hold their money. But so Treasury bill rates went this way, LIBOR rates went this way. That spread's normally supposed to be 1/10 of a point or so apart. They got as much as 6 points apart. That's the credit crunch, because then the banks can't get the money, therefore they don't have the money to lend, and that's when the credit crunch starts. That's why we had to take very quick and bold and decisive action. And some of it was not perfect. This stimulus package is not perfect. The first one, the bailout thing wasn't perfect. The first one with the banks, there's all kinds of stories about how that happened. What we're going to do with the banks now isn't perfect, and what we're going to do in the next round won't be perfect. But in all fairness to everybody involved, in both administrations, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, they're having to make it up on the fly. They're doing things they've never done before, facing a situation they've never faced before, and the cost of failure is catastrophic. So, you know, they're kind of having to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And under circumstance, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So that's kind of the situation that we found ourselves in with this whole thing, is basically we had to start making major, bold actions. And the Fed started doing it, and the other monetary banks around the country, national banks around the country around the world started doing it. Japan, Europe, the Bank of England, everybody started doing it, all the Asian banks. All the countries started passing stimulus packages and trying to throw money at this thing, trying to bring it under control. Now, people are watching the Dow, and people are trying to read the tea leaves, and everybody says, well, you know, the stimulus package is obviously not going to work because the stock market went down after the stimulus package was passed. The stock market passed the stimulus package 6 weeks ago. I mean, you know, they knew that the votes were going to happen, there was going to be some kind of stimulus package. The market had already factored in the stimulus package a long time ago, so that's not what it's reacting to right now. It's reacting to a lot of other negative headlines and that sort of thing. But if you want to know if we're doing better or worse, every day it's very, very simple.